have really grasped your final chance. I think you are somebody that will have put Europe back on track again, rather than being someone associated with other less favourable associations.
And now for the EFDD, the floor goes to Mr. Farage.
Mr. Juncker, that was the most open, honest and truly worrying speech I've heard in my long years in this place. The message is very clear. Brexit has happened, full steam ahead. So new plans. There's to be one powerful president for the whole of the European Union, a finance minister with fresh powers to, as you say yourself, intervene as and when he sees necessary, a stronger European army in a militarised European Union with a stronger and perhaps more aggressive foreign policy too, and more Europe in every single direction, and all of it to be done without the consent of the people. Your plan to fight the next European elections with cross-European, pan-European lists funded by the European Union, but not, as you said, to fund extremists, means what we will find is genuine democratic parties of opposition will not be able to compete in elections on the same playing field. It is reminiscent of regimes of old. Indeed, the way you're treating Hungary and Poland already must remind them of living under the Soviet communists, when you attempt to tell them how they should run their own countries. All I can say is thank God we're leaving. But you've learnt nothing from Brexit. If you'd given Cameron concessions, particularly on immigration, the Brexit vote, I have to admit, would never, ever have happened. And yet, the lesson you take is you're going to centralise, you're going to move on to this new, I think very worrying, undemocratic union, and you're deluding yourself, Mr Verhofstadt, if you think that the populist wave, as you define it, is over. If these plans of Mr Juncker's come to fruition, far from the populist wave being over, I doubt it's even begun.
And now for the ENF group, the floor goes to Mr. Wilimski. Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. We have to say these are apologies for European centralism. European Union is not Europe, and Europe is not the European Union. The European Union is nothing more than less than an association with certain rules, and you can change these rules. And to change the directions, well, we don't agree with it. I don't think you are allowed to make those decisions. It's the people, it's the citizen in the free voting system who are able to make decisions about the direction. And that's the thing. And what Mr Juncker said today goes exactly against that. What Juncker wants de facto is to force the European Union into a single state. And we know that the euro is not a success story. We have extraordinary debts. We've seen the astonishing unemployment. We've seen the astonishing negative social impact on people's lives. We see this incredible social instability. The second thing Mr Juncker wants is de facto to actually get rid of all the internal borders. We see 10,000, 100,000, millions of Africans and Arabs are going to be coming to our continent. Oh yeah, everything's going to be there, including terrorists. And we know that the people who committed the terrorist attacks came through these routes into Europe, and that is a threat to security for all citizens of our continent. And they talk about having a defence union, but no, we don't want that. What we want as Austrians, we're a neutral country in Austria. What we do not want to participate in the defence union. The right road for Europe can only be the road where there is more democracy left to the people, more democracy left to the citizen, where people can vote whether or not they want to have Schengen maintained or not, if they want to have their borders or not. The vote's got to be left to the citizen. reality of having free movement at a moment of terrible unemployment. It's the citizen has got to say whether or not they want that to be in place. That is what we need in Europe. Democracy, pluralism. You have to give more sovereignty back to the states if Europe's ever going to function. It doesn't work now, and you know it yourself. It would be good if we changed it.
La parola ora.
And now the floor goes to Mr. Papadakis.
The sixth scenario we heard for the future of the European Union is yet another attempt to find a compromise between the harsh competition that is going on within the EU and the Eurozone, where Germany has sprung far ahead from the other countries. At the same time, in all countries, all the governments are pushing ahead with very harsh measures against the workers. In Greece, in France, in Italy, they're relieving big businesses from taxes. You said some words about the EU becoming more powerful. It only means that the EU is in class against the United States, Japan and China. We cannot hide the fact that despite your talk about peace, the EU is actively taking part in imperialist wars. The EU is only becoming worse, and the people's discontent is growing every day. We need to overthrow the real enemy. Thank you.
Now, in the name of the Council, it's Masikas.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Speaking not on behalf of the Council cannot have a position on this.
Credible again for all EU citizens.
Ms. Morvai.
Thank you very much. Mr. Juncker, in your position, I think it's a very good idea to watch television every now and then. If you do so these days, you can see really good news from Syria and from Iraq. The wars are almost over. Rebuilding has begun. Refugees are returning home. Don't you think, and please answer this question, don't you think that it's high time to fundamentally reconsider the relocation and resettlement quota idea of the European Union? Stop bashing Hungary, stop preaching us about solidarity, and talk about solidarity to those strong, healthy, young Syrian and other men who should go home and rebuild their countries. That is solidarity with those nations. Thank you very much.
Mr. Christoforou. Thank you, President. I welcome the speech of the President of the Commission, and I'm particularly pleased that he focused on the core values of the European Union. We need to look at freedom, the rule of law and equality, Mr. President. That is what Europe is based on, and that's what the basis for a strong Europe, giving well-being to its citizens. And we shouldn't have agreements with countries like Turkey who don't share our European values. European citizens should feel proud when they take part in the freedoms which Europe has given them. And don't forget, we couldn't deal with countries which don't simply fail to respect human rights at home but have seized territory in my own country. It's important that we remember this and Don't simply allow the customs union to continue in the way that it is at the moment. We have values in Europe and we need to protect them together, Mr. President. Thank you. Ms. Costa.
Presidente Juncker, grazie.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Juncker, thank you for what you've said and your genuinely European vision. It's something which could put the wind in the sails of Europe again and help young citizens, particularly young British citizens who are going to be suffering the impact of Brexit, when we need to look at sustainable development, defence, foreign policy, more justice. We can play a role in the world, and that can only be guaranteed by more Europe, free, fair, united also in terms of the priorities that it has and the values which it shares. If we're going to do that, we need to have a cultural and educational dimension of the European project. They need to be leading elements on. 30 years on from the beginning of Erasmus, let me ask you whether we can't think about doubling the number of young people who are eligible. That's still only 5% of young Europeans. That would, of course, require a doubling of its budget. The European Cultural Heritage Year, which you mentioned, that's going to begin in Milan in December, along with our new cultural diplomacy. Ms. Mogherini and Commissioner Navracsics are behind that. That's a tremendous opportunity for us to share and disseminate our values and promote intercultural dialogue and developing Europe's social cohesion and creating quality jobs. Thank you very much. Mr. Smecker.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Juncker. Well, we keep on talking about a democratic Europe, about recovering the hearts and minds of our citizens
in a number of countries, and now the wind is blowing in the right direction. No, what the people want is not to continue with this Europe. They want the reformed European Union. 73% of our citizens want more European action on the side of migration. 75% want more European action against climate change. The same number want a European army. And at the same time, even more Europeans want European capacities and capabilities in the fight against terrorism. So it is true, Jean-Claude, that the last 3 years were not easy. It was mainly crisis management, but I completely agree with you that it is now the moment, now or never, I should say, like in the song, to build up that European Union that the people are asking for and that we together are already dreaming of for a number of years. And what does it mean? It means that we create a European asylum system so that we can finally get rid of this broken Dublin system, because there is the real origin of the problem. Dublin is not European. That's national egoism. That is Dublin. In fact, not Dublin as a city, naturally. So don't misunderstand me, because I'm going to have my Irish friends against me if I continue like that. A European border and coast guard and a system of legal, indeed, Gianni, migration, so that people no longer die on our shore, because every dead body that we find in the Mediterranean is a scandal for us, for Europe. Even one death in the Mediterranean. A European defence union, so that it are not the Americans and the Russians who are in fact deciding, Mrs. Mogherini, in our backyard, what is still the case today. A European FBI. Why? Because terrorists don't know borders. That's the reality. So why we continue to do so? And then also a real government for the Eurozone, so that we can steer the European economy and that we can create what in fact we are missing. European champions. It are our competition rules who are too narrow. In fact, it is the fact that we have no unified markets with single regulators who make that we have no European champions that can become world champions and compete on the world level. But there is one thing on which I have a little difference of point of view with you, and that is on the institutional problem. I'm always thinking that good institutions produce good policies, and that bad institutions create, in fact, stillstand, stagnation and crisis. And there are a number of examples of that. And that's the reason why we in this Parliament, and I thank you for the support, really, because it's very helpful, that we want
cannot be a Europe that is protectionist. And the ECR group believes that the EU needs to create more opportunities, not more regulations and more agencies. Many of our citizens tell us that they feel as if they have little say in the decisions we make about their lives, their countries and their futures. When it comes to their concerns over migration, security and jobs, they prefer an EU that complements their national and local governments, not seek to overrule them. Speaking as both a future neighbour who wishes to see a prosperous EU trading and cooperating with a prosperous UK, and speaking today as one of the leaders of the ECR group with MEPs from across the EU, being critical of the policies of the EU should not be seen as an attack on the EU, but a genuine desire to see an EU which regains the trust and confidence of its citizens. As a liberal conservative and a passionate believer in free trade, I welcome the emphasis on open trade in your speech. But modern open trade needs countries to shed the cloak of protectionism. Modern open trade needs to be open to the latest investment in technology to allow frictionless borders. Modern open trade needs faster broadband networks to allow SMEs to trade securely online.
In the report, but I think that the implementation of these priorities, the reform agenda that you have put emphasis on and that I subscribe to, will lead us to the outcome, and that is the sixth scenario, so the European Union that we want to have. Maybe someone will fall behind, but that of course remains to be seen. Final remark, unity. I believe, as you do, that we are in a better shape. But if we have still a problem, that is lack of unity in the Council, lack of ability of the Member States to deliver on what they have even proclaimed themselves before. One final remark, President Juncker, I'm not offended that you have forgotten the Czech Republic as a country that will also be 100 years old next year. No offense. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Kari.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit, I find it arrogant, Mr. President, that you say that things are going in the right direction, because that's not the view of our citizens. They see poverty, they see deterioration of their welfare, they see their salaries under pressure, they see high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and they see an EU that doesn't solve their problems but makes their problems worse. They see an EU that does not listen to them, but instead of looking at the real problems, you sit there with the rest of the EU elite in your glass tower saying you want more EU, more power to the EU Commission, a finance minister to control the member states even more in the direction of the Commission, a president over all presidents to make sure we have one union with one president. I find it arrogant towards our citizens and towards our democracy, and honestly I think that this Commission has plenty of powers already.
And now the floor to Senor Terry Cabras. President Kayane, Mr. Juncker, I'm going to talk to you today in Spanish. Surprisingly, you didn't mention the situation in Spain with the upcoming Catalonian referendum, because hundreds and thousands of Catalans have been asking for a referendum on autodetermination, just like the Scottish. The Spanish government never wants to speak about this or hear about it. The Catalan government has approved by a majority the law of the referendum, as if it were in fact a crime to have referendum. A court case has been brought against the president of the Catalan Parliament, and also against over 1,000 local civil servants who are working in favour of the referendum. These are unacceptable attacks on freedom of opinion. I'm not asking that you actually fight for independence. The Catalans can do it on their own, but I do ask that you actually require that the Spanish come to an agreement on the referendum. Why does the Commission not intervene in order to defend the freedom of expression in Spain? You do it in other countries, would you not? Thank you very much. And now the floor
for our group, and it's unavoidable if we want to back European industry, starting with small and medium enterprises, youth unemployment. But let me just say one question in my brief remaining time. Europe needs more democracy, you've said, but you didn't say anything about that. This assembly, directly elected by our citizens, doesn't have legislative initiative rights. Don't you think that should be on the agenda? We need to get the wind in our sails, as you've said, and we can do that if citizens really see that they're at the heart of everything we do in Europe. Thank you, President.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Garcia Perez.
Thank you, Madam President. For years now, Europe has stopped being part and parcel of our dreams, and the idea of our project, which is equality, opportunities, has become something altogether different. Precarious jobs, austerity, economic crisis. Today, those of us who believe in the European project will agree that there are grounds for concern, that we need to move ahead with new policies for the European Union. The European social pillar must be a priority. It's simply not possible for a 21st century Europe to continue to have a working class that lives below the poverty line. Let's talk about the fight against climate change. Let's face up to the fight against terrorism, asylum and immigration policy. These are of fundamental importance. Thank you, Mr. Juncker, for mentioning the rule of law. Europe is a project based on democracy. Therefore, it's fundamental that we guarantee a respect for the constitutional order of each and every member state. There's no time to be wasted. We need to get on with it and tackle these changes. Diversity, dialogue, respect, cohesion. This is what defines Europe. Let's not allow anything or anybody changes this. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. Sugar.
I most welcome with the emphasis you placed on the idea of Europe, the community of values, Mr. Juncker, that the need to ensure freedom, equality and rule of law all over the EU, so that there would not be second-class citizens anymore in our integration project. Still, European citizens belonging to national, autochthonous or language minorities can be treated very differently depending on where they live. Only last week in Romania, the Hungarian minority language Catholic high school of Târgu Mureș ceased to exist because of the systematic harassment of various authorities, where hundreds of minority language speaking children were at insecurity until the last moment about whether they would be able to attend their school again. What do the parents of these children who are interrogated by the Romanian anti-corruption agency for enrolling their children in the school feel from the rule of law that the EU is supposed to guarantee them? The EU still has a long way to go to ensure its values and prevent discriminative practices. More than 60 million citizens expect acknowledgement of their existence by the EU institutions. Thank you.
Mr. Weidenholzer, 1 minute.
At the moment, we're in a curious situation in Europe. We've got Trump, we've got Brexit, but thanks to that, people are more positive about the EU. But it's not all good. We're a long way from having solved the migration issue. And the improvement that in the economy that you have mentioned isn't benefiting everybody. Parts of Austria, for example, aren't seeing that. And there's also more of a disparity now between East and West. You know, I'm happy to see Mr. Timmermans here taking a very clear line. The Commission is the custodian of the treaties and has to guarantee the fundamental rights as a result. But it's this openness to dialogue that I'm not seeing in those who are trying to benefit at the expense of Brussels. How to act against that? Well, Brussels has to be better, more democratic, and act in a more social way. And I think you've given us a good basis for that.
Madam Vălean, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Congratulations for your strong messages in your State of the Union today. For the first time in years, our citizens show growing faith in the EU and its direction. Their confidence is justified proof that the EU remains where they put their hopes and where they want to live and prosper. For all this, we are obliged to keep our word and deliver on what we have promised. Some will say we need more ambition. I say we need stability, consolidation and proper implementation of EU policies. We need to defend our values to make sure our citizens can fully benefit from their rights and freedoms, and that the competitiveness of our companies is both defended and supported. Yet the engine of our internal market is not fairness but competition, and it has to be a real one. You can't send people home saying go compete in your own country while we protect our national markets, because the internal market is not the sum of national markets. The State of the Union should also be about how we can offer more Europe for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Mosca, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, trade policy is one of the most powerful instruments we have. And although obviously it can't sort out everything, it needs to be continually updated and improved to meet global challenges, which are constantly in flux. I was listening carefully to what you were saying, particularly about transparency, but I think we should really stress 3 points. First of all, trade is still a genuinely European policy, open, democratic, without sacrificing the need for us to pull together. That's why the Union needs to be ever more closely involved in all phases of the process and not simply Parliament's assent at the end of an agreement being reached. Secondly, sustainable development, if the chapters on that are going to be effective, they need to be binding. I'm glad the Commission's done what it's done, but it needs to continue thinking, bring it into real practice and providing sufficient money, and Parliament's willing to help on that. Thirdly, it's vital because opening up in terms of trade is based on fairness and reciprocity, and we can't have these waivers depending on who the partner is. That will threaten our whole economic system. Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. Rangel, 1 minute.
Madam Vice President, Mr. Juncker, my dear President, first of all, my compliments to you for today's speech. Thank you. I think this gives a new fillip to us. It encourages all of us who love Europe like Mr. Juncker. Now, there is a challenge which is not one of your immediate concerns, at least not those we heard today. This year, there was a wave of forest fires in Portugal with tragic consequences. There have been floods all over Europe, including recently in Poland, with tragic consequences. Last year there were earthquakes in Italy. There have also been earthquakes in Greece. And with climate change, there are going to be a lot of these catastrophes. Would it not be time to create a European civil protection force? Now, this, of course, ties in with internal security. Could have missions in the Mediterranean, rescue at sea, this kind of thing. But when this kind of catastrophe supervenes, we should get out there, help national forces to mitigate the consequences of such catastrophes. I think it's high time to create a European civil protection force, and it would be the embryo of what could eventually become a real European army. Thank you.
Mr. Bullmann, 1 minute.
President Juncker, Sie haben...
President Juncker, you've given a speech which meets up to your own expectations. It was sober, and we've heard that the East needs the West, but also vice versa. And I think the same goes for North and South as well. I've never been quite as revolted as the time when I had to read in the German papers saying, if you want coal, sell us Corfu. I mean, this was quoted from stupid politicians. And I'm very glad that you never got dragged into that debate, but you stood up to it. I know that that's not the level at which you operate, but we can't say that economic policy in Europe depends on who's in government where. Whether there's a Greek haircut is a technical issue. It shouldn't depend on whether or not your political allies are in government in one country or are not. We need a policy that can help the South to develop, but we need the South in this very difficult period the world's going through.
Mr. Kovachev, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm pleased with what you've told us, Mr. President. Now we need to achieve the goals that you've set. We need to be effective in the European Union because it'll be our fault if the European Union is ineffective. Next year, the EU needs to demonstrate that the promises to keep its citizens safe are going to be met. We should focus, therefore, on things like cyber security, control of our external borders, and solidarity to be shown with states where there are a large number of migrants entering. I like the idea of a cyber security agency, Mr. President. We also need to continue to help Europe recover economically and maintain its social standards and its public health standards. Also, we need to help those sectors where the crisis has hit us hardest, and we shouldn't allow any part of the European Union to be neglected. I'm glad that you're thinking about we not have a two-speed Europe. That's the most important thing. Thank you.
Mr. Bostinaru, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Domnule președinte,
President Jean-Claude Juncker, I would like to thank you today for the courage, the vision and the wisdom of your speech, but moreover for the force to oppose those who favorize the division of Europe and the double standards in the project of Europe with several speeds. On behalf of the Romanian delegation, on behalf of my political group and on behalf of my country, I share your vision and I commit myself to supporting you. If I analyze your speech, Europe can be an important player in matters of security only if we are united, only if we speak on one voice, and only if there is complete trust among all members. If we look at the cohesion policy, it is fundamental to implement the principle of solidarity and to reduce all disparities. And this is why I would like you to give attention to the continuation of this fundamental instrument of the Union. Union and solidarity means that there are no double standards in cases of enhanced cooperation, that Schengen cannot be refused when there are conditions which are fulfilled, and that the CVM cannot be continued unless it is necessary. And the quality of food is the same for all Europeans. Thank you.
Mr. Niedermayer, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam. And thank you, Mr. President, for your speech. It is good to remind us about how things have changed since last year. Just to remind all of us, growth is up, unemployment down, employment up, stable financial sector, improved fiscal policy. And this is just economy. You mentioned more. You can say these are just numbers. These are not just numbers. This means that life for people in Europe is better. And this is what people expect from us also. As you know from your past, a good time is exactly the time where people are making a lot of mistakes. And you urge us to not make mistakes in this good time and instead to do many good things. And I agree and I appreciate that. One of the obstacles that I want to stress is still missing trust. Trust among politicians, trust among people, trust among countries. I hope that in the next speech you will remind us that this has improved. This is very important. And also at the end of your speech you mentioned that we shouldn't be overcautious. This is exactly the way how to make the mistakes and to miss the opportunities. I hope we will not miss them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Van Bremt.
Voorzitter, commissievoorzitter Juncker.
Thank you very much, Mr. President of the Commission. Your speech was optimistic. Perhaps not fully fledged optimism was expressed, but the general tone was optimistic, and it's something I think we can support. with a fair degree of enthusiasm. Transparency, climate protection, the climate of industry, ensuring that there's more democracy. We completely agree. However, we were still left feeling that there could have been. We want a AAA on the social issues, 3 years discussion on social dumping and no results. Look, we need to ensure that everybody in Europe obtain work in the same conditions and receive the same salary. There's got to be proper social security enshrined in European legislation, and we'll be measured on our action, particularly on social action. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Ulvskog, 1 minute, please.
Fru talman,
Madam President, Mr. President of the Commission, thank you for what you've told us this morning, Mr. Juncker, and thank you for having talked about better standards for the labour market. These better standards will be crucial for the whole of the EU. We need to take positive measures here. Nothing divides us more than social dumping, which means that workers are set against workers and sell their labour as cheaply as possible. That's a disgrace for Europe, and there are many of us who are focusing our hopes on you to improve the situation. We need to have some kind of overseeing authority, but also legislation, a directive and legislation on the social market. That can't be done, the labour market, sorry, that can't be done from outside. We need a social protocol. Thank you. As you said on the Eurozone, we think you need to respect countries which don't want to take part, such as my own. That needs to be respected, that decision. Thank you, President.
Colleagues, we now move to catch the eye, and I will disappoint more people than I will please. So with that remark, I will try and give the floor to as many as possible, but probably around 9 colleagues. So immediately, for 1 minute and very strictly, please, Madam Spiraki.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, the citizens are waiting for us directly to show we don't like populism and extremism in Europe. We need to come up with rational, correct solutions. We can't, it seems, provide well-being for everybody. We need to make sure, however, that we encourage our citizens and reward as many of them as we can. We need to keep Europe safe from terrorism, and we need to have a European information service which will help that goal. We have large numbers of migrants, and member states need to look to their own responsibilities here and need to be sanctioned if they don't. The Greeks and the Italians are facing the brunt of this crisis, Mr. President, and we need to make sure that cuts in the budget for things like research don't hamper the situation still further. Thank you.
Aguilar.
Madam President, President Juncker, in your home straight, you've given us your longest speech with the most intentions. We want actual solutions, legal ways in, not just this blue card for selective immigration. We want humanitarian visas, decent jobs for young people, fight against poverty, particularly child poverty, fight against inequality, tackling fraud and tax havens. We've seen all of this in the Panama Committee. But above it, it's all about rule of law. Ignoring court rulings is being in breach of the law. It's a crime, and that can happen in Hungary, in Poland, and Catalonia. Anyway, it's a negation of Europe. We're about the rule of law.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Marias.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, your 5 scenarios for change in the European Union have now put forward a 6th one, where we continue with the same policies, the same institutions and the same balance